Imagine, just for a moment, that you are locked inside a prison,
Right.
but there are no iron bars. There are no armed guards pacing the perimeter. In fact, the doors are just wide open.
It's pretty easy to escape.
You'd think so, right? But the catch here is that you don't even realize you are a prisoner. Because you have been meticulously conditioned since the day you were born to believe that building and maintaining your own cell is actually the absolute highest form of moral virtue.
Yeah, that's a heavy thought.
It is. And what if I told you that the modern man is living inside exactly that kind of invisible prison? A system that the author we are diving into today calls the feminist gulag.
Feminist gulag.
Yeah. And what if I told you that you are actively paying for your own incarceration using a secret, invisible currency that is just systematically draining your time, your money, and, I mean, really, your very soul.
It's a staggering premise.
Yeah.
It completely reorients how we are forced to look at modern relationships, our institutions, and just the fundamental expectations placed on men today. When you start connecting the dots the author lays out, it really challenges the very bedrock of what society currently demands we accept as progress.
It really does. But before we unpack all of this, I want to quickly remind you to like and subscribe to the show wherever you happen to be listening right now. Today's deep dive is going to be a comprehensive, ultra-long, and really incisive review of a fascinating and, frankly, ultra-provocative new ebook.
Very provocative.
Yeah. It's called Simpoleans, Currency of Weakness by Conrad Riker. If you are a man trying to make sense of the modern dating market, if you are interested in understanding the history of our institutions before they were captured by feminists and Marxists, or if you're part of the men's rights movement or the broader red pill community, this book is an absolute must-read.
Absolutely.
You really need to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy a copy, and make sure you follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Now, before we get into the heavy lifting here, we really need to offer a very clear impartiality disclaimer.
Yes, very important.
This deep dive is an impartial, objective report on the contents of Riker's ebook. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the political, social, or ideological viewpoints contained in the material.
We're just the messengers.
Exactly. Our mission here is to act as your expert guides, to neutrally convey the author's arguments, his worldview, and the vast amount of data he presents. We are here to help you deeply understand his thesis, regardless of where you personally stand on the political spectrum.
Right, so our mission today is to deeply explore those claims, specifically how Western institutions, from our schools to our family courts, the media matrix, and corporate boardrooms, were systematically captured.
Right.
We're going to break down the mechanics of this Simpolean economy, explore the biological realities of female hypergamy, and finally, we'll explain the author's ultimate solution for men to reclaim their power using some surprisingly ancient intellectual tools.
It's a massive scope.
It is. So let's start with the title itself. We need to define what a Simpolean actually is, because the text makes it abundantly clear we aren't talking about dollars, euros, or cryptocurrency here.
No, not at all. The term is brilliant in how it frames intangible sacrifices as hard economic data. A Simpolean in this framework is an emotional token.
An emotional token.
Right? It is a psychological credit. It represents the social favors, the suppressed instincts, the swallowed pride, and the staggering amount of unpaid labor extracted from men in exchange for the mere illusion of love, sex, or belonging.
Wow.
The core argument here is that modern feminism is not a movement for equality. In this view, it is a predatory economic model brilliantly disguised as social justice.
You know, the analogy that really struck me was his direct comparison to feudalism. It's such a visceral way to picture it.
Oh, the serfdom concept.
Yeah. He describes modern men as serfs, who are tilling emotional soil that they will never actually own or hold the deed to. You're out there working the land, yielding the crops, bleeding into the dirt, but the harvest inherently belongs to the lord of the manor, which, in this modern dynamic, is the modern woman.
Right.
But unlike the feudal serfs of the Middle Ages, who at least knew they were serfs at the bottom of the hierarchy, the modern man is constantly told he is privileged. He is bleeding out in silence while being lectured about his systemic advantages.
And this isn't just philosophical theorizing. The text brings in sobering empirical data to quantify this invisible labor.
Okay.
There is a 2023 Stanford study cited that attempts to measure the invisible economy of relationships.
Okay, what did it find?
It found that men spend, on average, 1,200 more hours per year on unpaid emotional labor than women.
Wait, let's just pause and do the math on that. 1,200 hours, that is 50 full days, gone every single year.
Exactly. 50 days of waking hours.
That's insane.
And what constitutes this labor? It isn't time spent building a legacy, acquiring new skills, or even enjoying mutual reciprocal romance.
And what is it?
This time is categorized as conflicts de-escalation, emotional regulation of the partner, walking on eggshells, biting your tongue to keep the peace, and constantly navigating arbitrary emotional boundaries. It is the constant performance required just to maintain the baseline of a relationship in this new economy.
It is essentially a hidden tax on male existence.
Precisely.
When you put it like that, it sounds exhausting. And the author brings this down to earth with some incredibly vivid anecdotes that make that 1,200 hours feel very real. Take the story of the Colorado firefighter.
Yeah, that one is brutal.
Here is a guy who worked grueling shifts, saved his money, and proposed. Then his fiancée completely ghosts him.
Out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. He is devastated and spends $15,000 on intensive therapy trying to figure out what went wrong, blaming himself, doing the inner work society tells men to do.
Right, trying to fix himself.
Exactly. And what did he eventually find out? She had been sleeping with a TikTok dancer for 6 months.
Ouch.
The author's point is that this firefighter didn't just lose a romantic relationship. He lost years of emotional labor, financial sacrifice, and his fundamental self-worth. He paid in Simpoleans, a currency that the bank doesn't recognize, but one that leaves men completely bankrupt.
The concept of return on investment is a lens applied to human relationships throughout the entire text. To emphasize the asymmetrical risk, there's another story about a mechanical engineer in Austin.
Oh, the house one.
Yeah, this man worked double shifts for 2 solid years. He saved $80,000 for a down payment on a house for him and his girlfriend.
80 grand. That's a lot of double shifts.
The deed is signed, the moving truck literally arrives in the driveway, and that very evening, his girlfriend leaves him for a yoga influencer who sells spiritual alignment merchandise on Instagram.
That is just gut-wrenching, but I think I see the deeper point. She didn't take physical assets from him, did she?
No, she didn't take the house, but she extracted his utility. She took his future, his stability, and the 2 years of labor he dedicated to providing a nest. His effort became worthless to her the exact moment his utility was fulfilled and a more exciting, higher status option presented itself.
Transactional predation. That's the term used to describe this.
Yes.
The system incentivizes women to extract maximum value while offering diminishing returns, knowing there are zero social consequences for doing so. But if this system is so obviously flawed, at some point, a man has to look at the scoreboard. This leads us to what the text calls the Simpolean audit.
Right. The Simpolean audit is the breaking point. It is the moment of clarity where a man finally sits down and calculates the ledger of his life.
He does the math.
He looks back and realizes he has traded over 10,000 hours, 5 full years of his waking life, for female attention, validation, and the avoidance of conflict.
5 years.
It's the equivalent of working a highly demanding full-time job with absolutely zero benefits, no public recognition, no equity, and the constant looming threat of termination without cause.
Wow.
Men, the author argues, are socially conditioned from boyhood to believe this state of perpetual extraction is simply what love requires of a good man.
But let me play devil's advocate here. What happens when a man figures this out? Say a guy does the Simpolean audit, looks at his life, and says, wait a minute, I'm putting in 100 units of energy and getting 2 units back. I'm done. I'm closing the account. Doesn't he just walk away?
That is where the system's defense mechanisms activate. The text argues that the system immediately pathologizes the man who refuses to pay.
How so?
If a man withdraws emotionally, or if he sets a firm boundary and says, I will no longer fund this dynamic, he isn't viewed as a rational actor making a sound economic choice. He is instantly branded with psychological labels designed to shame him back into compliance.
Labels like what?
He's called toxic, emotionally unavailable, or the ultimate modern excommunication, an incel.
So the labels aren't actually diagnoses, they are control mechanisms.
Precisely. They are weapons of compliance. If you look at the broader behavioral conditioning at play, the culture is essentially training men to believe that basic self-preservation is a form of pathology. If you stop funding the system, you aren't just making a choice, you are morally condemned by the collective society.
Which makes perfect sense when you look at how dating works. But if dating is the informal, unregulated Simpolean economy, marriage is the state-enforced, militarized version of it. The author uses a phrase that I haven't been able to stop thinking about: asset forfeiture with flowers.
It is a chillingly accurate summary of his argument regarding modern matrimony. The premise is that the modern marriage contract operates as a hostile financial takeover where men are presumed guilty until proven rich.
Guilty until proven rich. That's a great line.
The author argues that entering into marriage under the current legal framework is stepping into an environment of catastrophic, asymmetric risk. Men invest everything: their time, their physical assets, their future earning potential, while women retain unilateral exit rights with virtually zero accountability or penalty for breaking the contract.
And the data he pulls from the National Bureau of Economic Research is just brutal. We aren't just talking about feelings here, we're talking about hard math.
What does the data show?
The text notes that after a divorce, a woman's standard of living drops by a mere 4%. A man's standard of living, however, drops by a staggering 73%.
73%.
Think about the gravity of that number. A 73% destruction of your lifestyle, your security, and your resources. The author even points out that many women actually gain an average of 30% more net worth post-marriage due to alimony, the division of assets they didn't pay for, and child support, even if they contributed very little or nothing at all to the household income during the marriage.
This financial devastation doesn't happen by accident. It is facilitated by what the text calls the family court machinery. The author presents a massive wealth of data to argue that the legal system exhibits profound systemic gynocentric bias. It is a machine designed to transfer wealth from men to women. For instance, he cites Statistics Canada data showing that 92% of emergency protection orders are issued against men.
92%.
The argument here is that even in situations of reciprocal conflict, or situations where the woman is the primary aggressor, the legal system is fundamentally calibrated to treat the man as the default offender and the woman as the perpetual victim.
Accuse first, win every time. That seems to be the built-in operating system of the Simpolean economy when the government gets involved, and the custody statistics are just as bleak. The book references Pew Research finding that women win primary custody 78% of the time.
And this is the kicker, that 78% win rate holds true even when the parenting records of the mother and father, their incomes, and their criminal records are absolutely identical.
They just default to the mother.
The courts just default to the mother. To illustrate how this systemic bias destroys individual lives, the text shares the story of a U.S. Marine. This isn't an abstract statistic. This is a soldier who returns from a grueling combat deployment in Afghanistan. He comes home expecting the sanctuary of his family.
What happens?
Instead, he discovers his wife has secretly taken out $60,000 in consumer debt in his name while he was getting shot at.
Oh, man.
Yet, when they go to family court, the judge awards her spousal support and full custody of the children, leaving this veteran, who is battling PTSD, with bankruptcy and a strict court order, to pay $2,800 a month to the very person who financially and emotionally ruined him.
That's unbelievable.
The author describes this not as justice, but as feudal taxation without representation.
It is genuinely infuriating to hear, but it gets darker. The legal racket extends deeply into alimony and the absolute nightmare of paternity fraud. Let's talk about the alimony risk premium. The author cites a 2022 study showing that 73% of alimony awards in no-fault divorce states are granted without the recipient even having to prove financial hardship.
Let me repeat that. No proof of hardship required.
Exactly. It's not about ensuring a dependent spouse doesn't starve. It's simply a wealth transfer based purely on gender entitlement.
And then the text touches on what is described as the nuclear bomb of Simpolean economics, paternity fraud. The author cites a highly comprehensive 2020 meta-analysis published in Reproductive Biomedicine Online.
The numbers on this are terrifying.
The data reveals that 1 in 10 men is currently raising a child that is not genetically his, completely unaware of the deception.
1 in 10. If you look at a crowded room of fathers, the statistical probability is that several of them are victims of deep biological betrayal.
Yes. And the author's main contention here is not just that the betrayal happens, but how the state responds to it. When these men inevitably discover the biological truth, often through routine medical tests, the family courts routinely enforce the child support payments anyway.
They still have to pay.
They still have to pay. The text mentions a man in Colorado who found out his son wasn't his. When he rightfully stopped paying for another man's child, the state intervened. They seized his tax refund, suspended his driver's license, and threatened him with jail time, while the mother faced absolutely zero legal, financial, or social consequences for a decade of deception.
That's just wild.
The author argues this proves definitively that the system isn't about protecting the family unit. It's about enforcing Simpolean tribute. The state acts as the enforcer for female extraction.
So if the legal and financial destruction is that absolute, that mathematically guaranteed to ruin you if the coin flips the wrong way, what is the invisible force keeping men at the roulette table? Why do men keep participating in an economy that hates them?
That's the evolutionary trap.
Right. The text points to a biological blind spot. The author argues that to truly understand the feminist gulag, you have to strip away the romance and look at raw biology. He claims that women don't actually fall in love the way men are culturally taught to believe through Disney movies and pop songs. Instead, they perform a constant, ruthless, evolutionary cost-benefit analysis.
This is the core concept of female hypergamy, which the text defines as the hardwired evolutionary instinct for women to seek genetic upgrades and optimal reproductive leverage.
Always looking for the upgrade.
Always. The author argues that while modern feminism relentlessly preaches equality and dismantling hierarchies, female biology is inherently and inescapably hierarchical. They are biologically compelled to look for the higher status male, the better provider, the stronger protector. They're incapable of loving downwards or even across. They only love upwards.
And he brings the receipts to prove it. He looks at the famous 2010 OkCupid data leak. This is raw, unfiltered behavioral data, not what people say on surveys, but what they actually do.
The real data.
The real data showed that women respond to a mere 0.17% of messages from men who earn less than they do. It's an algorithmic rejection. It's not a conscious choice. It's a biological filter. The author compares it to a high-frequency stock trader dumping penny stocks.
That's a great comparison.
Even more shocking, the data showed that 68% of women anonymously acknowledged they would leave their current partner if a man with noticeably higher status became available to them.
But wait, let's explore that friction for a second. If female hypergamy is a hardwired evolutionary imperative, if it's just biology doing what biology does to ensure the survival of the fittest, how can the author blame modern institutions for it? Isn't it just nature taking its course?
That's a great question, and it's exactly what I was wondering when I read that chapter.
Yeah.
The author's answer is that it's the combination of ancient biology and modern technology that creates the nightmare. He calls it Simpolean inflation.
Ah, I see. So in the past, a woman's hypergamy was naturally limited by geography and social circles. She could only compare her husband to the men in her village or her church.
Exactly.
Today, through dating apps, Instagram, and TikTok, women have global 24/7 access to the top 1% of men. Therefore, the baseline cost of female attention for the average man has skyrocketed into the stratosphere.
You got it. The text observes a massive shift in the creator economy where, as the author brilliantly puts it, women want platforms, not partners. The Bumble 2021 data he cites is wild. It shows women are 3 times more likely to swipe right on verified accounts, meaning guys with a blue check mark, regardless of the guy's actual income, his physical attractiveness, or his personality.
Social verification is the new 6-figure salary.
Yes, it's a proxy for tribal status.
The anecdote used to illustrate this human infrastructure concept is fascinating. The text details the experience of a Twitch streamer who had built a respectable audience of 500,000 followers. A verified Victoria's Secret model slides into his DMs and tells him explicitly, "I'll date you if you hit 1 million followers."
Unbelievable.
So, operating under the delusion of the Simpolean economy, the guy grinds for 2 years. He sacrifices his sleep, his physical health, his real-world friendships. He finally hits the 1 million follower mark, and true to her word, she actually dates him.
Only for 3 months?
Correct. Just long enough to integrate herself into his broadcasts, siphon his highly engaged audience over to her own channels, and then drop a highly produced, viral breakup video that doubles her own follower count while destroying his reputation.
Wow.
The author uses that story to illustrate that men in the digital age are no longer viewed as partners. They are treated as human infrastructure. Men build the audience capital, the wealth, the platforms, and women extract it.
Which perfectly explains why the traditional virtues men are told to cultivate are suddenly yielding negative returns. If you are a loyal, kind, providing man, you are actually penalizing yourself in this inflated market.
The Church of Nice.
The Church of Nice. If you are listening to this right now and you've ever been told by a woman that you're too nice or that she just sees you as a friend, pay very close attention to this next part.
The author unpacks exactly why being a good guy is actively punished. He cites a 2019 University of Texas study showing that women frequently view early kindness, agreeableness, and emotional availability from a man not as virtues, but as glaring signals of neediness and low mate value.
It's a total paradox.
Yeah.
We are told by the media to be soft and vulnerable, but the data says women are repulsed by it.
Because in a hypergamous market, excessive kindness signals that a man is easy to acquire and has no other options, which instantly lowers his perceived status. The text contrasts two archetypes to make this point: the barista boyfriend versus the tattooed mechanic.
Let's hear it.
The barista boyfriend is the guy who does everything right according to modern feminist dating advice. He brings his girlfriend coffee every morning at the exact right temperature. He remembers her favorite indie songs. He goes to her art shows. He's endlessly supportive, non-threatening, and emotionally communicative.
And what happens to him?
His partner leaves him for the tattooed mechanic who, as the author quotes the woman saying, looked like he could kill someone. When pressed on why she abandoned a perfectly supportive partner for a man who was emotionally aloof and occasionally volatile, she stated she realized she needed a man who could protect her, not a man who wanted to pay for her pottery classes.
That is the ultimate bait and switch. The biological wiring of women rewards dominance, stoicism, and strength, but the overarching cultural messaging, the schools, the media, the government, tells men they must be soft, compliant, and subservient. It is a trap designed to make men fail.
It's an impossible standard.
Which leads us to the inevitable question. How did men get convinced to surrender their natural instincts in the first place? How did the institutions get captured?
The author moves from the interpersonal dynamics of dating into a sweeping institutional critique. He argues that our schools, universities, and corporate boardrooms have been systematically captured by Marxist and feminist ideologies.
Right.
These ideologies view traditional masculinity competition, aggression, stoicism, risk-taking, not as virtues to be channeled into building civilization, but as pathologies that must be cured or medicated out of existence.
Let's look at the schools first, because that's where the conditioning starts. The text points to CDC data showing that boys are 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with conduct disorder and ADHD than girls.
5 times.
The author argues this isn't because boys are inherently broken or diseased, but because female-dominated educational bureaucracies have criminalized normal boyhood. The modern classroom requires children to sit perfectly still for 8 hours a day, a standard perfectly suited for female development, but entirely counter to male biology.
He highlights this with a story about an 8-year-old boy in Alberta. This child was pulled into the principal's office, subjected to a formal behavior intervention plan, and referred to a state psychologist.
What did he do?
His crime: he played a game of tag at recess and touched another student's arm while running.
Tag. A game children have played for millennia?
Yes, but under the new ideological framework, this was classified as unconsented physical boundary violation.
That is insane.
The author uses that anecdote to highlight how the defining traits of historical male achievement, physical energy, rough and tumble play, testing boundaries, risk, are now treated as toxic. The system is designed to break the male spirit before puberty even hits.
And if they survive the elementary schools, they enter higher education, which the author describes as a complete ideological slaughterhouse for men.
The slaughterhouse.
He references a 2023 Harvard study finding that men are 37% more likely to be expelled from college for misconduct than women, even when the evidence presented to the administration is completely identical. The text describes University Title IX offices not as fairness commissions or investigative bodies, but as gynocentric tribunals where due process is suspended and the male is always presumed guilty.
And from those universities, these conditioned men graduate into the corporate world, entering what the text calls the corporate gynocracy.
Corporate gynocracy.
The author intensely analyzes the diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, landscape. According to a Harvard Business Review study he cites, in companies operating under strict DEI mandates, men who has equal or superior performance metrics to their female colleagues are 42% more likely to be passed over for promotion. Merit, objective output, and revenue generation are replaced by ideological quotas.
The anecdote he provides about the Volvo engineer is the perfect encapsulation of this. Here is a senior engineer with a PhD in mechanical engineering and 15 years of flawless experience. He applies for a leadership role overseeing a critical new project. He's passed over.
Why?
Because the HR department determined he didn't demonstrate enough emotional awareness during the interview process. And who got the promotion instead? A woman with a degree in gender studies whose primary contribution to the company was facilitating a weekly mindfulness and meditation session, despite her documented inability to interpret basic engineering diagrams.
Incredible.
The author argues that corporate feminism is a hostile takeover that systematically replaces hard competence with emotional theatrics.
He scales this observation up by looking at Google's famous project Aristotle. Google spent millions trying to find the algorithmic secret to ultimate team success. They concluded the most important factor was psychological safety.
But there's a catch.
Big catch. The author dismantles this finding. He argues that what Google actually measured and rewarded were teams that prioritized emotional harmony, which in practice meant that female opinions and ideas were never challenged, critiqued, or subjected to rigorous stress testing.
And what was the actual business result of all that psychological safety? The text points out that when you looked at actual measurable innovation lines of code shipped, patents filed, revenue generated, those highly inclusive and emotionally safe teams lagged behind the more traditional competitive teams by 33%.
Yeah.
They sacrificed a third of their productivity just to spare people's feelings.
This systemic capture raises a vital question about enforcement. How is this ideology maintained on a cultural level without massive pushback? The author points directly to the media, describing a media matrix that actively and scientifically engineers male compliance from the cradle to the grave.
This part absolutely blew my mind because it shows how deeply neurological this war is. The text cites a 2023 UCLA neuroscience study that tracked the brain activity of teenage boys.
What did they find?
The researchers found that when these boys earned praise from girls for being agreeable, compliant, or self-deprecating, their brains received a massive dopamine hit. The brain span lit up in the exact same way it would for a cocaine user or a gambler winning a slot machine jackpot.
Neural enslavement.
The author states that the media preys on this exact biological mechanism, creating a state of neural enslavement. The media constantly frames male subservience, apologizing, and stepping aside as the only viable path to securing female approval.
And conversely, the media relentlessly frames male authority, competence, and leadership as laughable or inherently abusive. The text points to a University of Southern California study reviewing primetime television commercials over a decade. The study found that 79% of these commercials portray men as inept, childish, or incompetent in domestic roles. This is the pervasive bumbling dad trope.
Right. Think of almost every sitcom from the last 30 years. The competent, stoic patriarch of the 1950s was deliberately replaced by the Homer Simpson or Peter Griffin archetype.
Exactly. Sitcoms, movies, and advertisements consistently show men as oversized children who cannot operate a washing machine, who ruin dinner, and who constantly need to be rescued, corrected, and managed by their hyper-competent, eye-rolling wives.
It's everywhere.
The author argues this is not harmless comedy. It is a highly calculated form of social conditioning. The goal is to decenter patriarchal authority, to make young boys subconsciously associate male leadership with foolishness, and to make men accept a subservient, managed role in their own households.
Okay, so the picture the author has painted is incredibly bleak. The system is thoroughly rigged. It's in the biology. It's enforced by the courts. It's taught in the schools, mandated in the boardrooms, and programmed by the sitcoms. If you are a man listening to this, you're probably asking, how on earth do we fight back?
That's the question.
And this leads us to what is easily the most fascinating, empowering, and actionable part of the entire book: the weaponization of the Trivium. The author argues that the key to breaking out of the feminist gulag isn't stockpiling money or lifting weights. It is entirely intellectual. Specifically, he points to the ancient classical education framework known as the Trivium: grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
The author's historical framing here is genuinely brilliant. He notes that the Trivium was the undisputed foundation of Western civilization and education for over 1,000 years. It taught young men how to think, not what to think. But it was deliberately dismantled and buried by the architects of the modern education system.
Why would they bury it?
Because, as the author boldly states, a man who can critically think is immune to manipulation. You cannot run this Simpolean economy, which relies entirely on guilt, shaming, and emotional manipulation, on a population of men who know how to rigorously define their terms and instantly spot logical fallacies.
Let's slow down and really unpack these three intellectual weapons, because this is where the listener can actually apply this to their life today. Let's start with grammar for clarity. Now, we aren't talking about where to place a comma.
No, not at all.
The author argues that the ideological left controls thought by controlling language. He points to internal guidelines leaked from Google that explicitly ban the word man-made, forcing employees to use the word synthetic. He points to the Associated Press style book mandating the use of the singular they to describe individuals. The author says this isn't about being polite or inclusive. It is a deliberate tactic to destroy precision so that truth simply vanishes.
If we look at the historical parallel, The author is directly echoing George Orwell's concept of newspeak from 1984. If you destroy the definitions of words, if you blur the lines of biological reality through grammatical subversion, people literally lose the vocabulary required to articulate their oppression. But the text also shows how reclaiming grammar has massive practical power in the real world.
Yes, the Stanford custody study. This blew me away.
It is a vital piece of data. The 2022 Stanford study analyzed thousands of family court custody cases. It found that men who used concrete, causal, grammatically precise language during their testimonies were 31% more likely to win favorable outcomes.
31%.
Conversely, men who fell into the trap of using vague, emotional, or therapeutic phrasing, the exact language the culture trains them to use, were heavily penalized by the judges.
That is incredible. The system tells men to open up and be vulnerable. But when a man goes into court and uses emotional language, the system uses it to prove he is unstable. But when he uses cold, hard, precise grammar, he creates a defensive fortress. He wins 31% more often. Clear grammar is a shield.
Which brings us to the second weapon, logic for truth. The author argues that pure logic is actively punished in the modern woke cathedral because logic ruthlessly exposes the fraud of emotional narratives.
He has a great story for this.
He tells a fantastic story about a 22-year-old engineering student in Toronto who found himself sitting in a mandatory gender studies class. The professor stands at the front of the room and declares this fact: all male leadership is inherently oppressive.
And the kid doesn't just get mad or complain. He stands up and uses modus tollens, a basic classical logical structure. For the listener, modus tollens essentially means the way that denies by denying. It's an if then statement where you prove the then is false, so the if must be false.
What did he say?
So the kid says to the professor, if all male leadership is inherently oppressive, and female-led governments in countries like Sweden produce identical negative societal outcomes, then either male leadership isn't inherently oppressive, or oppression has absolutely nothing to do with gender.
And according to the text, the classroom went completely silent. The professor was stunned and couldn't refute the structure of the argument, so she just threatened him with a disciplinary hearing. This perfectly illustrates the author's point. Critical theory, feminist dogma, and emotional manipulation cannot withstand the laser focus of deductive reasoning.
He provides another hilarious but terrifying example of a college in British Columbia. A student was actually reprimanded by the administration for submitting an essay that contained a basic Aristotelian syllogism.
Oh, the mortality one.
Yeah. The student wrote, all humans are mortal. Women are humans. Therefore, women are mortal. The administration flagged the paper and called the logical structure hostile and microaggressive. The author notes that the moment logic leads to a conclusion that doesn't flatter the feminist narrative, logic itself is deemed an act of violence.
It perfectly demonstrates the fragility of the ideological capture. And that brings us to the final piece of the Trivium, rhetoric for power. The author identifies what he calls the narrative deficit among men. He argues that men continually lose in the culture wars, in family courts, and in boardroom disputes, not because they lack data or truth, but because they communicate exclusively in spreadsheets and statistics.
Right. Men show up with an Excel document, while the feminist system shows up with trauma theater and compelling tales of lived experience.
Exactly. The text points out that human beings are fundamentally wired for stories, not numbers. The author cites a UCLA neuroscience and storytelling lab, finding that narrative structure is 10 times more memorable to the human brain than raw data. A statistic is easily forgotten, but a story of injustice is burned into the memory. The author urges men to master rhetoric, to wrap their logic and grammar in compelling emotional storytelling. He essentially tells his readers, stop apologizing for your data, stop presenting your truth timidly, start presenting it with fire, with moral conviction, and with narrative dominance.
It's basically saying use their own weapons against them, but back it up with actual truth. Which brings us to the grand finale of the book, the Simpocalypse and the Restoration. The author says that a global awakening is already happening under the radar. Millions of men are quietly mastering these tools, looking at the ledger of their lives, initiating the Simpolean audit, and deciding to simply walk away. He calls this event the Simpocalypse, the moment men universally, globally refuse to pay the Simpolean tax.
And he looks at international examples to prove this isn't just an internet theory, it is a macroeconomic reality playing out right now. He points heavily to South Korea's Sampo generation. This is a massive demographic of young men who are organizing online and actively intentionally giving up on courtship, marriage, and having children.
They're walking away.
They have done the math and opted out. The result: South Korea now has a record low birth rate of 0.7, threatening the very existence of their economy.
He also looks at Japan. A recent government survey showed that 35% of unmarried men in their 20s and 30s explicitly stated that women simply aren't worth the financial and emotional cost, almost half the young male population. The author argues that the feminist economy is rapidly imploding in these highly developed nations because the entire system requires male extraction and male labor to survive. Without the host, the parasite starves.
And the text points out that walking away actually heals men. He cites a fascinating 2022 study published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology. The researchers monitored men who consciously withdrew from the modern dating market.
What were the results?
Within months, these men showed significantly lower baseline levels of cortisol, the primary stress hormone, and marked improvements in cognitive performance and emotional stability. The author uses this data to argue that participating in the Simpolean economy is quite literally a biological poison that degrades male health.
So, if the system is collapsing, what does the author's vision of the restoration look like? It's not about protesting or begging the government for change. It's about building offline resistance and parallel institutions. He details the rise of underground, invite-only groups called Sons of Logic, currently meeting in major cities like Berlin, Austin, and Vancouver.
These groups are described as physical spaces where men gather to train physically, share hard skills, network financially, and rigorously debate classical philosophy entirely free from female influence, the male gaze of social media, or the crushing pressure of the Simpolean economy. They are building a new foundation in the shadows.
The author's ultimate message to his readers is a militant call to arms for complete self-mastery. Rebuild your life without Simpoleans. Reclaim your time. Keep your money. Master the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric so no one can ever manipulate your mind again, and focus entirely on building your own legacy. It is an incredibly powerful, deeply unapologetic conclusion to a relentlessly provocative book.
It certainly is a comprehensive and unflinching thesis, and if we take the author's premise to its absolute logical extreme, it leaves us staring at a profound and slightly terrifying question about the future of human society.
Exactly. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to ponder. If the Simpolean economy completely collapses globally, exactly as the author predicts, if birth rates plummet past the point of no return, and marriage rates fall to zero across the entire Western world because men universally refuse to participate, what exactly replaces the concept of romantic love in the 22nd century? Do we revert to purely contractual arranged partnerships governed exclusively by strict logic, legal parity, and economic mutualism? Or will a completely new, currently undefined, and perhaps unimaginable social dynamic rise from the ashes of what this author calls the feminist gulag? It is something incredibly deep to mull over.
A fascinating sociological puzzle, and one that the next generation will inevitably have to solve.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As a quick reminder, please like and subscribe to the show so you never miss an analysis like this. We just reviewed the incredibly fascinating, ultra-long, and vital ebook Simpoleans, Currency of Weakness by Conrad Riker. Do yourself a favor and head over to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now to buy a copy for yourself, and make sure you follow at Conrad Riker on Substack for his latest updates. See you next time.